Senate will be in order. Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in the richest country on earth, millions of seniors should not have teeth rotting in their mouths or be unable to afford hearing aids or eyeglasses. In America today, the reality is that a quarter of Americans 65 and older are missing all of their natural teeth, and 20% have untreated dental cavities. Further, 1 in 3 seniors suffer from hearing loss, while 75% who need a hearing aid cannot afford one. And further, it can cost seniors up to $300 for a routine eye exam and over $200 for a pair of glasses, which many seniors simply are unable to afford and do without. This amendment is simple. It expands Medicare to provide dental, vision, and hearing benefits to our seniors. This should not be a particularly tough vote, given the fact that the last poll I saw had 84% of the American people in support of this concept. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Senator from South Carolina.
Yes, I would urge a no vote, simply because we're living in a world where it's hard to get by. Growing the government, I think, will create more inflation. Everything can't be free, because it gets to be so free that you can't afford it. So you're the same people that told us if we passed American Rescue Plan, all would be well. We're at 9.1% inflation. You're increasing gas taxes. Now you want to expand Medicare. This is going to hurt the American people. Stop the madness. Vote no.
Questions on the amendment? Is there sufficient seconds? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein.
Two each.
Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Arono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Resch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders,
We have them right here. AKA gremlins.
Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz,
Don't get them.
Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby,
I won't be wearing these when we come back. It'll be amazing.
Ms. Sinema,
Yeah, I could.
Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Sanders, Warnock. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Braun, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hassan, Hawley, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, King, Langford, Lee, Lujan, Lummis, Marshall, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Hall, Peters, Reed, Risch, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, Wyden, Young. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Schatz, no.
Sanders.
Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Miss Cinema, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 3, the nays are 97, and the amendment is not agreed to.
President.
Senate will be in order.